India looks to Africa for new opportunities, and a partnership it says will be based on Africa's needs, not exploitation. So is New Delhi offering something different? And how much of a threat is it to China's dominance on the continent right now? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. When it comes to influence in Africa, one country towers above all others: China. The leadership there has spent billions of dollars investing in Africa, developing ties that have given Beijing to the resources it needed to fuel its economic growth. But now there is a new player in town, India. And you know it means business when it invites leaders from all 54 African states to a summit in New Delhi. The meeting is an ambitious attempt to strike up a new partnership with the continent, one the government of India says will be based on mutual benefit. Read that as a reference to Chinese practices in Africa, which some have described as being exploitative. But although India is trying to define itself in contrast to China, it has to be said its current trading habits are pretty similar. Have a look at this. Most of India's imports from Africa are raw materials, including cotton and precious stones for its diamond cutting industry, which is the largest in the world, we should point out. Crude oil's a big one too. India is Nigeria's largest importer of the stuff. But some perspective is needed here too. Have a look. Trade between India and Africa has almost tripled since 2006, up to its level of around $70 billion a year. That, however, is nowhere near China's trade with Africa, which topped $222 billion last year. So we've got lots to discuss on today's Inside Story, so we should introduce the panel. Let's start in Washington, D.C. with Amadou Sy. He is the director of the Africa Growth Initiative. In Johannesburg is Shanti Pai, economist for the consultancy firm Nascence Advisory and Research. And rounding out the panel in New Delhi is Sriram Chaulia, executive director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy. Gentlemen, thank you. Pleasure to have you with us on Inside Story. Sriram, let me start with you in New Delhi. This summit itself, before we get into the relationship, let's talk about the summit itself. The fact that Narendra Modi and the Indian government have managed to get leaders and players and business people from every single African country to come, that's a big win in the first instance, isn't it?
It is. It is a vote of confidence on the part of Africa's leadership about India, and I think they look at India with a great deal of hope and optimism and expectation. And this is a sign that India has arrived on the big stage in many ways, because the previous summits we've had with African nations have been rather small and selective. Groupings of 10 to 15 countries only. So it's Delhi is looking like the capital of the developing world these days, this week. Everywhere it's the talk is about Africa and how we can march together towards new horizons. Both of us are rising centers, power centers, and increasingly the view is that South-South cooperation is going to take a fresh turn and move in new directions with the push that Prime Minister Modi is giving, especially towards the African continent, because in the past there has been a sense that we have not really lived up to the potential of this relationship, but now it seems like we are going full steam in terms of hosting leaders, but also in terms of expanding the agenda. Many more issues are on the platter, and it looks like this is actually a grand summit that we are witnessing in Delhi.
And just to speak briefly to Prime Minister Modi himself, it almost feels to me like it's part of his world tour, because he has made a big point in his first year of going to see so many different leaders around the world, and now he brings a whole lot of them to him as well. This is clearly part of his strategy, isn't it?
Yes, some people have called it his diplomatic homecoming, because he's been itinerant, mostly outside the country, and now he's hosting a grand summit like this with more than 40 heads of government and state from Africa. So I think, yes, it is spreading Indian influence around the world, and they see it as part of the story of our expansion as a major power in the world. And especially with Africa, I think the softer elements are at play, development assistance, trade, of course, as you mentioned, and also human capital building and skill enhancement and transfer of technology, low cost, innovations, all the things that will provide life chances to Africans and also, of course, benefit India. So that's what we are seeing here. It's a mutually beneficial win-win kind of cooperative move that's happening.
Shanti Pei in Johannesburg, let me bring you in. Do you view this with the same positive nature that Sriram has?
It is. I think also to say that obviously this is not something new. India is not forging a new relationship with Africa. There has been a long-standing relationship. We know here in South Africa, that we have a very strong and big population of Indians and
of
people of Indian descent, and certainly, the political ties remain quite strong, and certainly the business ties. So this is a continuation and perhaps a strengthening of the relationship. One of the interesting things really between, when we discuss the relationship between, Africa and China and Africa and India, one of the things that always have come up is whether or not, Africa, subscribes to sort of the Chinese way of doing things. For example, whether or not it's business, it's business relations, it's political relations, labor relations, and, political structure. And we know, for example, that, India has a really strong and good democracy that might be modeled in many parts of the continent. So those relations will be good. But certainly, as Africa is trying to move towards a services sector, moving away from, or at least bolstering and diversifying the economies away from the extractive sectors, India probably will play a very good and strong role in terms of developing a services sector, but in many other ways, of course, in trying to develop Africa. So this is very positive, and I think in many ways will be received as such, and is being received as such by the locals and many African leaders indeed, and by showing themselves to have traveled all that far to attend the summit.
Right. Amadou in Washington, let me bring you in. And seeing as Shanti in Johannesburg has introduced the China element, let's try to incorporate that. What do you see as being the major differences in the approach between the way China has gone into Africa and the way India already is, and India may go or may change in the future?
Well, there are lots of similarities, really, between the two so far in terms of the economic ties. Most of Africa's exports to China and to India are in the form of commodities, natural resources. So I think really the question here is that what will African policymakers really do to leverage the increased interest by both China and India on the continent? So there we have really this agenda of transforming African economies, of providing jobs. And so it's up to the African themselves to also negotiate that when investment from India or from China comes free with transfer of skills, a transfer of technologies, and so on.
We'll talk more about that in a moment. Let me just stay with you a moment on and again, this is picking up on a previous point about the different styles. The fact that India is a democracy, is that a better thing perhaps for African nations rather than dealing with China, which says, hey, this is how we do it, this is how we want to do it if you want our money?
I would say maybe the biggest difference, two differences. One is definitely India has soft power within Africa. Gandhi lived in South Africa. We remember Nehru and his support for the anti-colonialism movement and the non-aligned movement. So there is a strong soft power by India here in Africa. But this said again, I am realistic. Business is business, investment is investment. So I think it's up to both parties, and up to also, I would like to see, African policymakers saying, okay, we want to increase regional integration, we want to increase, transfer of skills, and then try to work with India to achieve that. But this said, if you look at issues like climate change, Africa can gain support also from India, in terms of getting financing for climate adaptation. It also can gain support from China. So really, for me, it's up to Africa saying we are integrating in this global environment, and we need to have a policy coherence here when dealing with outside partners.
Business is business. Shanti Pei, he's right about that, isn't it? I mean, we can talk about all the nuances and differences and styles that we like, but it's money in the end, and it's business, and whoever's got the best deal is going to be the one who gets the work in the end.
Sure, and I think this is a very important point, which connects to what was being mentioned, the idea that, the negotiations have to be taken in such a way that actually the Africans themselves are negotiating for business and they're making sure that they're getting a good and a fair deal. Now, one of the interesting things, if we are still on the line around the relationship, if you differentiate between China and India, is that, in South Africa especially, we know that, we have a very strong and big and very connected and integrated population of Indian descendants, or also of Indians who have moved to the country rather recently. So that is something that is quite positive, because I suppose if you are doing trade and if you are working together, one of the things that you can do much better is you can do better if you already have some sort of cultural integration, some sort of language that you already know you speak, some sort of connection. And those connections and ties are rather very strong. Of course, we know, we've had some issues between, India and, for example, Uganda. But one of the things that is happening is this idea of thinking around how do we negotiate better as Africans and in these economies to make sure that you do get these kinds of skills transfer. One of the interesting things, actually, we are seeing are many Indian companies that are coming to South Africa, whether to start manufacturing plants, or they're here, for the services sector that has grown phenomenally. And one of the things that helped me negotiate is around how South Africa is going to make sure that there is a skills transfer. One of the things that people have been complaining about already is that many of these companies do bring many of their own people, many of Indian people who are coming to South Africa, rather than to actually maybe bring a few so that they can then develop the skills and growth and create the jobs here in the local economy. So that's a very, very big thing that has to be negotiated so that everybody does actually benefit, both here in South Africa and across the continent.
So something I've picked up from all three of you here is that whilst we're talking about this now, and we're talking about it through the prism of this summit that is happening now, even so, Africa has always been on India's radar. There are long-standing ties. Sriram, let me ask you what you think about how India capitalizes on that. And again, we have to look at the China element here, how it does something different, how it leverages itself to become a stronger player.
Geographically speaking, India is a lot closer to the African continent than China is. And we share a common littoral region which stretches from the Arabian Sea all the way up to the Gulf of Aden. So the Western Indian Ocean is basically a common home for a lot of African countries and of course for India. So that distinguishes us from China. And secondly, and that has implications, remember, for transport costs, for burgeoning trade and all these things, the geographical proximity. The second point, of course, is the cultural affinity, as my colleague has just pointed out. We have close to 3 million Indians, a large diaspora in Africa, and these have settled and have integrated, have become local citizens. These are not like an enclave economy model that the Chinese bring temporary workers and set up settlements to build roads and highways. These are actually, naturalized citizens of most of these countries. Many of them contributed to freedom struggles against apartheid. As you know, the ANC in South Africa, for example, has very many Indian leaders, people of Indian origin. And so all these are obviously cultural factors that bind us together, and we will be leveraging these. Prime Minister Modi often plays up the diaspora aspect, and he has actually raised the quantum of our diplomacy towards the diaspora. And I think whenever he visits the African continent, one can be sure that he will be trying to leverage and tap into the energies of the diaspora, many of whom actually have a kind of a cultural closeness to Mother India. So he refers to all of them as children of India, no matter where they are. Right. We have changed our attitude towards the diaspora under Prime Minister Modi. We have, treated them not as stepchildren who have forgotten the motherland, but rather as our assets on the ground in many parts of the world. So I think these will distinguish us. I want to also mention what distinguishes us from China, of course, is our commitment to human resource development. I mean, it's not just that we are extracting minerals and that we are following the Chinese path. I must say that on the other hand, we are building the human capital needs of Africa in a big way. We have been doing training of trainers from everything from cattle rearing to bamboo manufacturing to solar electricity. So there is a wide range of projects that are being discussed at the summit and will be implemented, which basically talk about how to raise the life chances of ordinary Africans. And even our enterprises hire far many more local Africans than Chinese do. Even our enterprises have far less of a carbon footprint. So in terms of energy intensity of production also, Indian corporations have done far better, and it's a proven fact. Okay. So all these mean that actually both Africa and India are late industrializing regions, and both of them have complementarity. We don't compete that much. When we export, we are not depriving African local producers or causing injury to their local production. Rather, we are only competing against other exporters to Africa. So I think all of this improves the consumer welfare in Africa and preserves jobs.
Let me get a quick word from Amadou before we move on to another topic, and that is the fact that, well, first of all, everything that the Sriram's just said, but also the fact that India's approach seems to be a more corporate approach, Amadou. It's not so much just money and infrastructure, it's led by the private sector. Do you feel that will help in what you were talking about earlier, and that's the idea that it's fair, that African people get properly involved?
So it can definitely help. And I see some areas where definitely Africa can really have a win-win relationship with India. For example, we all know that most of the African poor live in the rural areas, and we need really to improve the productivity of African agriculture. And there are lots of lessons that we can learn from India, and lots of experiences that can be maybe transplanted in Africa. Dairy production also is another one. Agribusiness. Manufacturing. So, for example, Tata Industries has an assembly line in Senegal, which is one of the few in that country. So I think there are definitely lots of sectors that can benefit in Africa from Indian experience and from the Indian private sector. For example, ICT, we all remember Bharti Airtel buying Zain in terms of the mobile phone, which was one of the biggest investment in all emerging markets at that time. So definitely, but I wouldn't really, again, I don't really feel that the real question is playing China versus India. From an African perspective, this is all good. Global trade is increasing. So let me give you an example. Nigeria used to export a lot of oil to the US. But with the advent of fracking and other technological advances, the US is not importing Nigerian oil anymore. But India is now. Nigeria is exporting more oil than Saudi Arabia to India. So this is a very, very good development. And Angola is also now exporting a lot of oil to China. So I think and right now, as the external global environment is getting a bit dicey, we can see that as China might experience an economic slowdown, Africa can benefit if India is more resilient by exporting more and trading more and having more investment to and from India. You know, this said, coming back to the diaspora, you know, most of Indian investment to the continent goes through Mauritius. About 90%. So there is something also, there's room to also look at other countries, and this is just because of tax benefits.
Okay,
right? So the investment is a bit misleading.
Okay, I'm going to hold you there just for a second, because there's something else I want to look at. You know, India is looking abroad for investment and opportunity, but there are problems to think about closer to home too. Just a few numbers to think about. Around 360 million Indians living in poverty in 2012, according to the National Planning Commission, which is about 30% of the population. Around 400 million people don't have access to electricity, and even those who do experience frequent power cuts. And a third of the illiterate adults in the world are in India. And one more thing, government corruption costs about $6 billion every year. Sriram, this is one for you here, and I know this is a really easy thing to say, that why spend money there when you could be spending money at home? But I still think it's worth asking. The Indian government and Indian businesses have a lot to do at home before they go fixing up Africa.
No, I don't see a contradiction between pursuing domestic economic development and supporting Africa's rise, because these days, you know, we're talking about an interdependent world. We cannot rise when our fellow developing countries are stuck at the bottom, you know, so we rise together. And that's the whole idea of South-South cooperation, that through trade as well as through skill transfer and through human resource capacity building, we can actually improve. For example, Africa has a demographic dividend. You know, the average age is like 19 or 20, and India is also in a sweet spot, at least for the next couple of decades. So we have like really young populations with a lot of aspirations, and we have done things to be able to fulfill the aspirations on both sides. So, for example, we have this Pan-African e-network that does telemedicine, teleeducation, health, animal husbandry, and so on. And all of these are training a lot of African youth to improve their life chances, but also giving opportunities to young Indians. So I think, yes, there is a section in India which still says, let's fix our house first before going out. But I think we are past that stage now. We cannot afford to lose whatever we want to call it, a race or whatever, to great power status. I think the Indian government has now, under Prime Minister Modi, stated that we must attempt to become a leading power in the world. And for that, we cannot wait another 20 years until, our home is fixed. And I think, frankly, through exchange, we're going to actually raise value on both sides. And the era of, sequential foreign policy after domestic policy is over now. We are talking about a government that wants to increase Make in India. And Make in India is a flagship project of the Prime Minister Modi and can only happen with African resources. Yeah. And there is also talk about Make in Africa, and the African visitors here in Delhi are saying, why don't you also come and make in Africa? And there, our small and medium enterprises can do it. So,
well, why don't we ask
Shanti
about that,
there
actually?
There is a kind of
because why don't you tell me, Sriram's brought up the issues of African youth, about working through exchange. What can Africa give back here? How do we make this a two-way street?
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognize so that India does not actually have to fix their domestic problem. Part of the whole idea of trade and exchange is not so much for India to come to Africa with aid, but actually looking for opportunities for both development. So if they're coming in interested, for example, in infrastructure development or in the telecom sectors, that is a positive thing, right? That they are here to actually expand their own opportunity into the opportunity that is a growing Africa. So certainly there is that possibility, and it's quite strong. We know in Africa that we have this really, really serious problem around educational outcomes in science and technology. And so we need to be able to actually access those markets much more easier. So that actually, if we were able to say, that for every, one citizen of India who comes to Africa looking for a particular opportunity, that another is sent back to India. So those exchanges are able to happen so that we can actually grow, human development, whether it is that, India is still very much probably at its infancy in terms of just making sure that that infrastructure around the rural areas is developed. And what was very successful around what China did was to actually tap into those African resources to be able to forward that. Now that they've done that, there's an opportunity to look for another partner, because we know Africa continues and South Africa continues to have these vast resources. Now, those relationships must be developed. They must be on a very commercial basis, on a very competitive basis, so that everybody actually does benefit. So it should not be thought of at all as a sort of aid kind of relationship in which if you haven't fixed your own problems at home, this should be taken as an opportunity to fix those problems at home.
Amadou Sy, I've got about a minute left, so I'm going to leave the last word to you. You said it earlier, business is business. It's got to be done right, doesn't it? Because one of the, and I think it's more an anecdotal thing we talk about, but we always hear about the way Africa gets exploited, how people come in, take the resources, take the money and go. This has got to work properly. What, in your opinion, is the number one thing to make sure that it happens properly?
I think it's really, again, back to the policymakers to listen to their people, to listen to all the stakeholders, and have a common position when it comes to Africa's development and just implement. And India is showing the way in that sense, and we can have a win-win relationship.
The final word there with Amadou Sy in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your time. Also, Shanti Peyi in Johannesburg and Sriram Chalia joining us from New Delhi. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. And as ever, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Plenty of ways for you to get in touch with us. You can go to our program page on the website at aljazeera.com. If you're on Facebook, you can post your views and questions to facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. If you're on Twitter, you can use AJ Inside Story. You can tweet me at Kamal AJE. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.